Rem, we've gone around the table and there have been a variety of different positions, from Farshid in some ways emphasizing the importance of architecture, to Michael emphasizing the importance of cities, to Olafur emphasizing the importance of the air that we breathe. And I know that you have been thinking a lot also a lot in the past in a kind of projective manner, but nevertheless for a number of years you've been very interested in the history of the city, if we can speak of it that way, or the phenomenon of preservation, or our approach towards preservation. I know that your exhibit here in many ways is developing a kind of strategic approach towards the question of preservation. Given all the work that you have done on the city, how do you see the future of the city in relation to this question of the preservation of architecture or the environment?
I apologize in advance for not being precise in terms of answering your question, or for talking slightly off the subject, but at this point I really can't do anything else, except to say that what we show in our own section of the exhibition is two parallel phenomena that of course both have enormous effect on our cities, but I am not talking about the cities anymore. I'm also talking about everything that we, in our rush toward the cities, have left behind. And so increasingly what we have left behind is a big concern for me. But what we did is simply make an inventory not only of all the institutions that promote preservation, not only of all the new categories that are introduced as an argument for preservation, not only to look at how preservation in itself, from an approach that is concerned with artifacts or possibly natural conditions, to something that is becoming much more diffuse and something defined as heritage, and which is in fact on its way to become a right, and that is a kind of very bizarre condition. One of the interesting statistics is that if you look at everything that is preserved right now by the UNESCO, about 40% is in Europe, and then all the other continents have their own kind of little percentage. But if you see at everything in the pipeline, there will be a drastic adjustment, and what Europe has is 20%, what Africa is 20%. So heritage is becoming a politically correct issue. But what we discovered is that if you add everything where there is kind of preservation, that we count more than 12% of the surface of the earth, including the water. So it's not only them, but including the water. So I think we are, in all our discussions about about ecology, all our discussion about city has now taken into account perhaps a new regime where part of us has to live with radical change, and the other part has to live with what we call radical stasis, things that stay the same. And I think we have not even begun to kind of consider the consequences of that, and we have also not really begun to consider the implications of preservation at this scale on the simple livelihood or liveliness of cities. So that is all I can say at this point.
Can I ask you one quick question, which is that
yeah, I mean, maybe one more point. So as part of, or rather as a counterpart to this enormous attempt at remaining stable, we also rewrote the United Nations Charter and try to propose a series of norms that we could use to take things out. Because I think that what we will very soon face is to take things away, a philosophy and a theory of how to take things away.
So one of the things that I know Joseph Rickworth is here, and he knows about this kind of thing a lot more than I do, but one of the things that exists in terms of architecture, in terms of old buildings, in terms of heritage, is this phenomenon of age value. That buildings that are after a certain moment in history, they actually have a value simply because of the fact that they are old. So age value itself has become a kind of fetish in some way. Now that you're working or reworking the concept of heritage or old buildings, one of the things that I think it seems very critical is the way in which you are thinking about reprogramming or rethinking historic buildings in a different kind of context. Is that something that you could maybe speak about a little bit more specifically in terms of the relationship between new and old in some ways?
Well, I think that what we there's at some point in the building there's in the show there are two opposing ideologies at the core of preservation, and we identify them with either Ruskin, and that is because Ruskin is perhaps one of the most profound thinkers about aging, in general, and about authenticity, and one of the most aggressive ones to think about the whole issue of what it means not to change, and it probably means simply to decay. And the other camp, which is Viollet-le-Duc, who felt that in order to present the past, it has to be in its most splendid form. And perhaps if you look currently at how the virtual and the digital are working, it's a kind of a return of Viollet-le-Duc with a kind of perfect Roman form and the perfect antiquity at our fingertips in that form. So I think that we are probably personally, I'm on the side of Ruskin, but that is a very inconvenient side to be on as an architect, as you know. So we have basically tried in a number of projects to approximate as close as possible to do nothing. And to try to experiment with whether that was still a branch of the profession that we could possibly develop. But it's obviously a very utopian position.
Who would like to maybe from around the table or make some comments? Olafur, do you want to maybe speak, or Michael?
No, I am somebody who is certainly in favor of saving at least 95% of the buildings of Venice. But I do think there is something slightly problematic about architecturalizing the concept of preservation. I mean, in New York, the most vexatious aspect of the right to remain, of course, has to do with tenancy. We have both preservation laws for buildings and rent laws for citizens. And one has observed over many years the way in which the right of remain, to remain, that is associated with individual tenancies, has been displaced onto buildings to the exclusion of the ecologies they have historically supported. So I think a theory of preservation has to engage the idea that Palestinians and Israelis claim the right to remain. Farmers would like to stay on the land. Elderly people in apartments on the Upper West Side do not want to be kicked out by the rising character of the real estate market. So an architecture uninfused with the idea, or a preservationist architecture uninfused with the idea that there are human values at stake, I think doesn't comprehend the whole picture. So for an ecological perspective, let us include other forms of citizenship.
I think in, not to be anecdotal, but within art history, there's been a kind of, attempt to rediscover preservation within museological questions, and obviously it's not about sort of reinventing history, but it is about somehow introducing a sense of performative history, or looking at history with regards to its sort of performance, rather than the sort of more static idea of solidifying history and so on. And I think there's a parallel in architecture. But having been inspired, I think, from some artistic projects, I see a lot of dialogue now, which has to do with the, let's say, the counter-numbness factor. And numbness in the city, obviously, is more temporal question, because it's not necessarily being numb to the consumer or the sort of next rendered sort of presentation by an architect, but the numbness is with regards to the past and to the future. And people being numb does not mean that you don't do anything, but being numb means that you're very predictable. So I think there is a kind of, it's called the emotionalization of space. And as you can imagine, emotionalization is not necessarily an extrovert activity. Obviously, it takes into account that you kind of engage. And what I went through your space, Rem, insight with regards to the preservation, and clearly there is a very strong emotional component, which especially in the not doing anything part, right? So doing nothing can also be very emotional. And obviously performative, let's say, sort of history is something which I find it interesting in its emotional causality, because being emotional is much more triggering, because it's much more activating, and obviously being numb is, let's say, less activating. So, so there is a sort of there's a sort of very strong psychological component to this that I'm interested in.